So have you ever wondered what the Chinese were using as swords at the time of the Viking era, for example? Or indeed, have you thought about what the ancestor of the Japanese katana was? Well, in this video, you're going to see. And courtesy of LK Chen, who have sent me this sample, we have here the Frontier Tang Dao. Now, I know that a number of you have been looking forward to me reviewing this, and I pictured it in a couple of places so you knew I had it. It's a very, very interesting sword historically. But before I go on, I should mention that this video has been done in conjunction with Matthew Jensen, who very clearly has done a whole bunch of testing, some of the testing which I either wouldn't have been willing or wasn't able to do, including destructive testing. So we're going to be hearing from Matthew in this video, and I highly recommend that you go and check out his channel. He has got tons of reviews, particularly of Japanese swords, but also of others as well. He's got European style swords and of course the Chinese swords from LK Chen and others as well. So tons of stuff to check out there. Go and check out his channel. Now, many of you looking at this may immediately go, oh, it's like a straight katana. Well, it gets complicated at this point. So when does this sword date from? Well, first of all, this isn't a direct one-to-one replica in the sense that the hilt and scabbard fittings are separate from the blade, okay? The blade is modeled off an example found in Chinese excavations, so it is a Chinese Dao of the Tang dynasty. Now, the Tang dynasty is 7th to 10th century or thereabouts. So we're talking about in Europe a period when swords somewhat like this is a replica of a Anglo-Saxon sword that would have been used in the 10th century, for example. So swords, one-handed swords like this were the norm. Broad type 10 type blades, big slashers, big heavy slashers, well not really heavy but formidable, shall we say, point of balance usually fairly far up, used with a shield. Whereas what we start to see in China is we've moved away from the jian in centuries before this, in fact. So these earlier types of jian that were used 2,000 years ago had given way in a military context, if not a civilian one, in a military context to the Dao. Okay, so swords like this, and this is a model I'll be reviewing in a future review video. So the Dao replaced them more or less on the battlefield. The jian never completely disappeared from the battlefield, and we do in fact have some 19th century examples of jian which were used in warfare. But by and large, the jian became more of a civilian sword. You could maybe compare it in a way to things like the rapier in Renaissance Europe. And the Dao became the predominant military sword, and the Dao went through many different developments, evolutions. And this is the type of Dao, this is one type of Dao that was in use in the 7th century. So 7th century in Europe, we're talking about the migration period, the formation of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in England. This is before the time of Charlemagne. So we're talking about the time when the Germanic tribes had taken over essentially from the Roman Empire and the beginning of medieval Europe. So we're talking about the early medieval period in a European historical context. And this type of sword in its proportions, you'll see, closely matches later Japanese swords. And that is no coincidence. Now, when researching the history of this type of sword, I found a number of things which make this video quite complicated for me to make, and is one of the reasons that I've held off making it. But thank you to Matthew Jensen's input. It has lightened the load because he's done a lot of the physical testing and reviews of the fixtures and fittings of this, which mean that I could focus a little bit more on the history, although this isn't going to be an in-depth history, and I'm sure that some of the things I will say won't be 100% correct because this is a really big topic. So here's the issue. Fundamentally, there was a type of Dao that was used in China at this period, and certainly these blades have come about through archaeological excavations and in collections, and so we know a fair amount about the blades in China at this time. But complicating this, most of them don't have many hilt fittings surviving, or the hilt fittings are in a very poor state of preservation. But in addition to that, we also have these Chinese swords in Japan. And some of the best preserved examples we have are in Japan, and they were brought over in the 7th and 8th centuries into Japan and then kept in a very good state of preservation. But, and this is where it gets complicated, the Japanese in many cases messed with the fixtures and fittings. So it's somewhat difficult to know in many cases when particular fixtures and fittings date from on the Japanese examples. So just because you've got a 7th century blade doesn't mean that you've got a 7th century hilt. And anybody who studies Japanese swords will know that this is a problem with Japanese weapons in general, because Japanese blades were used for a long time, but they were modified. Often we find the tips reshaped and reground, the blade lengths are cut down to meet new court regulations. Sometimes the tangs are shortened, requiring new holes to be drilled through at different points. The hilts were constantly changed, the scabbard fittings were constantly changed. So it's quite difficult to replicate a sword from a specific time when it's from Japan. But what we have here with the Frontier Tang Dao is essentially a blade which is pretty much historically correct for the 7th century, and a slightly speculative hilt design and scabbard design, which is inspired by ones in sort of preserved in temples, essentially in Japan. So therefore, is it a Japanese sword? Is it a Chinese sword? Well, it's supposed to be a replica or a slightly speculative, best guess replica of a 7th century Tang dynasty Dao. Okay, I hope that was relatively clear. Now, there are a couple of things which are maybe quite speculative and perhaps not very accurate with this. And one of these things was highlighted to me by Matthew Jensen, who studies a lot of Japanese swords. And one of those is this habaki, okay, which we've got down here. And the habaki seems to be not necessarily specifically made for this sword. I'll talk about the fit and the finish and stuff like that. And we suspect that this habaki is just simply one that is used on a model of katana that has been put onto this sword. But if it's modelled on originals in Japan, then the question is, are the models in Japan a 7th century habaki, or are they a later habaki that's been added on when the hilt's been refitted and preserved, refinished, whatever? We don't know. But the construction of this sword and the arrangement of the hilt, you will see, is very, very similar to a Japanese sword. We have a tsuba guard. It is much smaller than a normal Japanese tsuba, admittedly, but functionally it's kind of a tsuba. We have a grip which has the bamboo pin through, exactly like Japanese swords do, okay, makugi, and then we've got the habaki, and then the blade form is quite similar to Japanese swords. Now I'm going to focus on the blade for a second. This is the other contentious and complicated issue. So obviously over the centuries, Japan and China's histories have been interesting, shall we say. At times there has been a lot of cross-pollination cultural, and at other times there's been war. So there are many reasons why sometimes artifacts from either China or Japan don't necessarily acknowledge their influence of the other, or sometimes they overemphasize the influence of the other, or they claim to have influenced the other. It's very complicated and political. But I think that there is very little doubt in my mind that these Chinese Dao blades with these forms are the basis for what became the Japanese tachi and ultimately the katana as well. But if you look at Japanese sword books, some of them would dispute that fact, and they would claim an entirely native Japanese development for those blades. And admittedly, their blades have a slightly different point shape. They're more of a gradual point instead of this angular shape, although we find these, as mentioned, in Japanese temples and such like, and preserved there. But the cross section's very, very similar, and their blades, the Japanese blades, are curved. Even it seems that the heat treatment is similar with the edge quench, and this does have a hamon, which of course we find on Japanese knives and swords. So in my mind, there is no question that the basis for what became the archetypal Japanese sword, the tachi and the katana and the wakizashi, is this type of Chinese Dao. However, I have to make it clear to you in this video that that direct relationship and that direct influence is not agreed with by students of Japanese swords always. And they don't all agree with each other on the development of Japanese swords. And so it's a very contentious and complicated topic. If you want to find out more about it, I suggest you go away and read yourself. There is tons and tons and tons of stuff to read on this topic, on the development of Japanese swords. And you will find that any potted history of the development of the early Japanese sword usually is contradicted by someone else's history. So moving on from that, the sword itself shares basic physical characteristics with a katana or with a short tachi. Okay, it's not really long enough to be a tachi, and it is straight. Okay, we have to absolutely concede it is straight. It doesn't have the curve that we associate with most Japanese swords. Although some of you out there are familiar with modern culture will, I'm certain, will say it looks like a ninja toe or a ninja sword. Yes, as far as I know, they have a dubious historical precedence, and it's not something I've specifically researched yet, but if you want me to do a video about ninja swords, then I will do so. But absolutely, we do sometimes see straight blades in Japan. Not to say that all Japanese blades are curved, you do get straight ones. And of course, we know that the Jien even appears in Japan, both in temples, Chinese Jien survive in temples, and it appears the Jien as an emblem and as a symbol, even carved into the blades sometimes of katanas and in artwork and such like. So they were familiar with straight blades, they just tended to have slightly curved blades. So back to the Chinese sword. So it appears that this was the type of sword that was used in military and to some degree civilian life in China in the 7th century. With a hilt approximately of this form and a blade exactly of this form. They were used on horse, they were used on foot, they were used in civilian life. So this is the kind of all-purpose, a bit like a katana was later, a kind of all-purpose sword.
Hello there, viewers of Schola Gladiatoria, and thank you, Mr. Easton, for letting me jump in on this conversation. I as well have a Frontier Tang Dao review sample sent to me from LK Chen. Mine, however, is in a state of disarray, and I can tell you a little bit about how it got there, and hopefully you find the information useful. Before I talk about the cutting, I do want to talk a little bit about the scabbard. These fittings plain just fell off while I was using it. The folks at LK Chen did basically supply me some glue and said they'd do the same for anyone else that had the problem, but you shouldn't necessarily have to do that. Either way, they were saying that they're going to use a different adhesive, or are now, so hopefully future iterations of this sword or the other ones out there don't have the same problem. Anyway, yeah, they just kind of fell off while I was using it, albeit in a martial arts style that isn't applicable to this sword, but this little thing caught on my belt and I don't exactly know how this one fell off. Either way, worth noting. The other bit, when I got to cutting with the sword, effectively I took it to a pool noodle first, and I found the edge to be insufficient. Not so much that other people would find it dull, it was one of the sharper swords that LK Chen sent, but I didn't think it was going to make it through used Japanese tatami. And ideally with those pool noodles, it just kind of pops apart, and that's what happens when the edge is razor sharp, and I thought I could get it there. Now, fortunately I was right. I brought it to a belt sander with a leather strap belt attached to it, and I rubbed some jeweler's rouge on that strap. It only took a couple passes with that mechanism to really get the edge exactly where I wanted it to be. Now, after the sharpening, I brought it to a pool noodle, and effectively it had the results that I was hoping for. The noodles kind of popped apart, and while the cutting might not look spectacular, obviously I'm not particularly good at it, I would say the results were good for me. After the pool noodle, I took it to a used Japanese tatami mat, and I was trying to be very vigilant for any kind of bends. I know another person that has one of these, and effectively he said that his bent relatively easily, so I was trying to be watchful about any kind of bends. Given my bad form, it's likely going to happen. And I did have some bad cuts, and the good news is this one did not bend, at least with the used Japanese tatami mat, on any of the bad cuts. On some of them, I'm going in an upward diagonal angle, and it comes out, and my cut looks pretty much flat, which means the blade must be absorbing a bit of shock there, and I don't see any bends, at least in doing the used Japanese tatami mat cutting. Honestly, I thought it cut really, really well. It was very easy to move around, and it cut through the targets pretty cleanly with the refined edge that I put on it. So after the tatami mats, I took some loose interpretation of trying to move a pole arm out of the way. Now this is a 2x2 piece of lumber it's treated, and it's not particularly hardwood. It's not really analogous to a spear shaft or a pole arm of some sort. Anyway, they just basically kept breaking, and it was at this point that I started to notice some bending, albeit minor. And really, it's worth noting that throughout the course of this destruction that I'm doing on this sword, at no point did it bend so much that it wasn't usable as a weapon, albeit in some sort of diminished capacity. So I've striked this 2x2. It keeps breaking, so I move to a harder material, and it's at that point that the blade really starts bending. After that, I brought it and I struck it on some flats of a 2x8, or a kind of just a flat piece of wood. Maybe it'd be analogous to a shield, albeit granted not quite the same. And I was honestly impressed with the edge retention here. So after doing that, after several relatively hard strikes onto these wood surfaces, the blade maintained a level of sharpness that allowed me to shave hair off my arm. So I was pretty impressed with the edge retention, but I would say it bends relatively easily. That might just be a byproduct of having a thin blade that's differentially hardened, but edge retention good, blade bendiness not so great. After that, I brought it to a sword-on-sword type contact scenario. Now, this is an old 1045 differentially hardened blade that I used in a different video, and it is broken, and I did some edge-on-edge contact. And very quickly, it started biting into the blade and left some very severe scarring. It did act as expected, though, so throughout the course here, chunks of the blade are chipping off, and it's my understanding that that's what you should expect when you're doing edge-on-edge contact or steel contact with a differentially hardened edge. Pieces of it are likely to chip off. Anyway, after I did several strikes against the edge, I flip it around, strike it on the wood, and it broke in one strike. It's a recipe to break a sword, so I'm not surprised it did that. And I have the kind of cross-section of the blade so you can see the grain structure for any of the folks out there that happen to know more about metallurgy than I do.
All right, metallurgy friends, you might know more. Is this a good grain structure or not? I'm not entirely sure, but there it is, fresh from the break, so you can see yourself.
Anyway, I was impressed with the edge retention, and I also really liked dynamically how the blade moved around in my hand. It's not one that I'm particularly familiar with, but I would say it's lively and comfortable to move. Not particularly impressed with the kind of resilience of the blade, if you will. It took a bend or a set a little easier than I'd like, and I was very disappointed with the fittings falling off. Now granted, glue was sent to me, but it's still not something I think you should have to do, and whether or not you agree, I suppose, is up to you. How historic and all that kind of stuff is, honestly, I'm going to leave that up to you. But hopefully you found the supplemental information useful. Anyway, cheers.
As I said, Matthew has done a fantastic review of this, and I don't need to repeat all of the things that he said, but I'm going to pick up on a few things that I think are worth mentioning about this particular replica from my point of view. I'll talk about the handling and that kind of stuff in a minute. But in terms of fit and finish, so at first sight, very nice looking. I absolutely love the rose copper fittings instead of brass. As I've made clear probably in previous videos, I'm not a big fan of bright brass, just aesthetically, and that is a purely subjective personal thing. I personally do prefer this copper colour or a bronze colour or an aged brass or whatever. Bright brass I find unattractive. Therefore, I do find it unappealing that they've got these lovely rose copper fittings and then this bright yellow brass habaki here, which looks out of place. And Matthew mentioned this as well. I think not only does it look out of place, but it looks like it's been taken off a relatively cheap katana. Whether that is historically accurate to a 7th century Tang Dao, I don't know. Okay, right, so we're not a fan of that habaki, and also the fit and finish. Again, he went into this. The fit and finish is not great. There is a gap in there, which, as I understand it in Japanese sword circles, is a sign of poor quality or poor fitting, and that is frowned upon. And mechanically, I can understand that if any moisture or liquid is coming down the blade, blood or water or anything else, it would go in there and you wouldn't be able to see it, and it would rust away on your blade or the tang, and you don't want that. So it's not a great habaki. We do not like this habaki. We would strongly recommend that LK Chen improve that habaki. At the very least, improve the fit of it on the blade, but preferably change the finish of it, because it really clashes horribly with this really nice copper fittings. The copper fittings are nicely cast. They're a little bit sharp. They're not sharp edged, but I think they could be a little bit sanded or rounded on the edges. The tsuba, however, or guard, is very nice, and we like that. Okay, the scabbard fittings don't fit great. Now Matthew's end piece fell off, okay? Mine hasn't, mine is secure so far, but they are only glued on, okay? And with expansion and contraction, different climates, especially something being shipped from China to the UK or China to the USA, sometimes things expand and contract and the glue breaks, okay? So we understand that historically, these were probably either friction fit or glue fit. So, you know, it's not necessarily really a criticism, it's just something to be aware of. And both of our swords, now I've actually wedged mine up. I can't actually move it now. There we go. But anyway, both of our swords, the middle fitting here came loose. What I did to fix that, so I think what Matthew did is he glued it. What I did was I actually, because the scabbard tapers and gets wider down here, I actually just rammed it down on. So that's friction fit. Now, as you know, I have a lot of antique swords in my collection, and some of those have friction fit fittings, particularly on scabbards and sometimes on grips. And actually, if the friction fit is good, if it's really put on firm, then it will stay on practically forever. So I think that I've probably rammed that down, that's now solid enough, and I didn't have to use any glue. More difficult to do when you've got an end fitting because there's nowhere to kind of ram it through to. So the scabbard, nice wood, very nice finish on the wood, very, very smooth, beautiful finish, beautiful wood. The scabbard fittings fit okay, they're not amazing, and as we say, they can come loose. Now in terms of the blade, so the blade is really the finest point, certainly I think in terms of the production quality of this sword as a whole. It has a cross section quite typical to Japanese swords as well, where we have a flat section and then a long gradual bevel, which should make a fantastic cutter. It's nice and straight, there's no bends or warps, the edge is perfectly in line, the tip is nicely formed. I don't have, Matthew's I think had a little bit of damage at the tip, my tip's absolutely fine. In terms of the edge geometry, beautiful. I mean it's a replica, so I can't really criticise the edge geometry anyway because a replica is a replica of the original, but it is absolutely smooth down to the edge. There must be a micro bevel, but I practically can't see it. Now, in terms of the sharpness, this is possibly one of the sharper swords that I have had from LK Chen. So down here, it's actually not very sharp, okay? Then it starts to get decently sharp about there. And from there upwards, I can run my fingers along the edge, but I'm doing it very, very lightly. I can feel it wants to bite in, and if I push down a little bit more, it would. So it's reasonably sharp, certainly sharp enough to go straight out into the backyard and cut some bottles up with, or tatami mats or whatever. In terms of the feel of the thing, I know incidentally Matthew hates this, and I'm not a big fan of either. It's a bit difficult to know what to do with it, especially when a lot of the time you would be using this sword one-handed, so that connection point for the lanyard is quite far away. But anyway, in terms of how the sword moves, it's lovely. It's about 900 grams, it's a 29-inch blade, so it's a bit shorter than a tachi, but it's quite long for a katana. And yeah, it moves absolutely beautifully. You can move the thing quick and nimble, and the fact that it's straight means it has practically no rotational inertia like a curved blade does. I think it's very, very nice. The cross section of the grip means you can feel the edge alignment very, very well. No problems there. It's quite a flat grip, which I like. It's quite broad this way, quite flat that way. But let's talk about one kind of elephant in the room when it comes to the grip. The grip is super, super smooth. Now, the problem is we talked about the problem of these grips and the historical evidence for them. And I don't know how much evidence we have to go on in terms of the shape and the finish and surface of this type of grip. But they are slippery, okay? The fact is that that's just quite slippery when I'm just handling the sword dry like this. If I have two hands on the weapon and I'm cutting, that's not so bad, okay? It's just like holding a stick at the end of the day, or a pole arm. But one-handed, the problem is it does have a waist to it, but the problem is that waist kind of makes the problem worse because your hand wants to slip down to the thinnest part. And I want to just, as Matthew mentioned in his video, I want to hold the sword up there, but when you start swinging it one-handed, the hand wants to slide down to there, but then the balance feels horrible. So it's kind of tricky. I feel like the originals may not have had a grip like this, and maybe if there are originals with grips like this, then maybe they were made purely for display or storage, like Shirasea maybe, or I don't know. They just don't seem hugely practical. And when we look at most grips, certainly from China, they're usually wrapped in some way with a silk wrap or a cord wrap. Or when we look at Japanese swords, of course, they've got the same underneath, and then we've got the silk wrap over the top. So everything's designed to give you a good grip. And admittedly, there is the hidden Tang Dao, which just has a smooth wooden grip, but that's partly because it has to be able to go inside the scabbard. So it's a little bit problematic for me to know whether this is historically correct. But from a user point of view, I do find it a little bit too on the slippy side, and I wonder if it should be textured more. I wonder if originally they were wrapped or ribbed for my pleasure. I don't know. But I find that quite a slippery grip. And I've got to say, I kind of find it a bit weird looking because quite a lot of decoration has gone into the fittings of the hilt and this little flower around the lanyard, which I'll talk about in a second. And it seems strange to have such a plain wood, because you've got to bear in mind in the modern world we have grown to like the aesthetic of plain wood, but historically in most cultures plain wood was, well, that was normal and boring, so they usually decorated or created some kind of surface to it, or covered it, or painted it, or whatever. It seems a bit strange to me that that's just plain wood. It seems a little bit out of place on this type of sword. It's a bit like someone's taken a katana and taken all of the, the shark skin and the silk cord off the grip and left it bare. But that, again, that's not to say this is a historical replica. If the historical replicas are like that, well then so be it. If the artwork, if it's shown in artwork like that, then so be it. Just saying that from a personal perspective, I find it quite slippery, and maybe the shape of the grip or the texture of the grip needs to be rethought a bit. Now finally, this lanyard. So I don't like the lanyard that's been put on here. It looks like a piece of paracord. It looks unattractive and modern, and I think it looks out of place with the sword, and I'd be inclined, and I probably will, just undo it and take it off. That being said, we have this issue of the hand sliding down, okay, which does mean that you might want to actually use that lanyard to wrap around and tie around here almost as a hand stop, possibly, okay, and that fitting in some ways would almost benefit from being covered up, because it's a little bit sharp on the edges. Because it's been made out of quite thin copper, it should be, the edges should be perhaps rounded a little bit more. It's a bit of a friction point or a hot spot for the hand. Not that certainly your lead hand isn't going to be down that far, but your secondary hand might encounter it. I mean, it's not a huge problem, but I almost feel like the lanyard wants to be wrapped around it somehow to cover up that edge and provide some better anchor point for the hand. It's a tricky one. One final thing, and if the sharp-eyed amongst you there will have noticed just then, I was holding the sword the wrong way round. And funnily enough, that's an issue I found with this sword. It has a symmetrical hilt. So your hand can't tell whether the sword is pointing forwards or backwards. And several times when I picked up this sword and been handling it and thinking about it and what to say in this review, I've been swinging it like this, and I've suddenly noticed that the edge is pointing towards me. And that's a bit of a strange issue, and not one I'd ever really thought of before. Because when you pick up a Japanese sword, whilst the grip itself may be kind of symmetrical, although there's usually a bit of curve in the grip, and the tsuba is usually roughly symmetrical, of course you can feel which way is forwards and backwards because of the curve of the blade. And strangely, when you make the blade straight, you can't feel that anymore. And if you've got a straight sword like a Jien, that's not a problem because you've got two edges, so it's all completely symmetrical. But when you've got a straight single-edged sword with an asymmetrical point, it's actually quite problematic having a completely symmetrical grip. Now, again, I don't know if the originals are like that, but I believe that they are. So it's just something, it's not really a criticism, it's just something to note and be aware of. The fact that sometimes in this period, you would have had to have looked at your sword rather than just feel it. You would have had to look at your sword to know whether it was pointing the right direction. Bit of a strange thing really, but there you go. You can have a single-edged sword but not know which direction the edge is pointing in without looking at it. Interesting thing to know. Yeah, so very, very clean, very easy to cut with, no hand shock. Nice. Nice and clean again, it's very similar to cutting with a katana. Didn't quite make the last one. 8 cuts, not bad. Yeah, it's very, very similar to cut with as a katana. It's easy, it's stiff, it's forgiving, it's got a long region of cutting ability because the blade's very stiff relative to its length. It's quite short for me, 29 inches for a two-handed sword seems quite short, but that's the same as a katana. Grip length is very much similar to a katana. So yeah, really, this is basically, as it's set up at the moment, kind of like a 7th century Chinese inspired, or Chinese Dao, very similar to a katana in its physical properties. And I have to say, no problems holding onto the grip two-handed, but I'd be a little bit nervous one-handed with it.
Alright, so for me that was actually a pretty good result. Now, not necessarily this one, you can see where I'm trying to go upwards at a 45-degree angle and it looks like I'm pretty much cutting horizontally. That's not the sword's fault. The sword actually moved through the target surprisingly well. I'm not seeing any bends. The edge still looks like it's in very good shape.
frame at once. So hopefully you're able to see that it has a bend now. Flip side, the edge still seems very sharp. I don't have any paper to cut, but I don't know that I'll need a special camera angle for this. You can see it pretty clearly. So the blade is bent up this way, then down, then back. Alright, so several more strikes in, and what I'm noticing is that the blade is beginning to pitch forward, so it's impacting and it's causing it to bend kind of in this area. And in fairness, the edge actually still feels pretty good. Let me check. Well, it's still, I don't know if you're able to see, it is shaving here. Not terribly cleanly, but it is actually shaving. The edge is still very keen, sufficient to cut, but it's bending. One strike cut pretty deep into the blade. So some pretty deep gashes, and this is actually working the way that I would expect it to, in that there are some very deep chips, and that's kind of what a differentially hardened edge is going to do when you do edge on edge or metal on edge type contact. You should see some, not rolling necessarily, at least my understanding is you're going to see some chipping like this. Alright, sword friends, thus far it has been pretty dinged up, and I'm going to do the breaking now. I'm going to flip it around on the back and I'm going to smack it on the spine. Alright, metallurgy friends, you might know more. Is this a good grain structure or not? I'm not entirely sure. But there it is, fresh from the break, so you can see yourself. Alright, sword friends, now it is broken, but I would still say, in fairness, even in its diminished capacity, I can still use this quasi-effectively to cut and smack and thrust, even though, obviously, I'm not going to do much in terms of penetration with thrusting. But I could still use this kind of as a weapon, even though it's broken. Soft as it is, it did hold an edge pretty well, and at no point did it bend so significantly I couldn't completely use it.
So I hope this has been fun and useful for you. The Frontier Tang Dao, it is a very nice sword, but there are some things about it I don't quite understand, and I don't know how historically correct they are. There are a couple of things I don't like, particularly the habaki, but thank you once again to Matthew Jensen for doing his part of this review, because he went into far more depth than I could on the actual fixtures and fittings and also the testing as well. So it's been great collaborating with him. Go and check out his channel, give him a subscribe, and I will see you again back on Schola Gladiatoria channel with a video on a completely different topic sometime really soon. Give us a like and a subscribe, and take care, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.